In December 2022, two researchers opened a wooden cabinet inside the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery in Hobart and lifted out a flattened, striped animal hide with the fur rubbed thin in places. The wear came from children's hands. School groups had been allowed to pat it for years, and nobody in the building knew what they were touching. It was the last Tasmanian tiger that ever lived. But she wasn't the animal you're picturing right now. The animal in your head is a male. He's the one in the grainy black and white footage from the Hobart Zoo, pacing a concrete pen, turning to the camera and opening his jaws wider than a jaw should go. He's on the tourist signs and the beer labels and the state's own coat of arms, and he died months before his species did. The last one was an old female, and nobody ever wrote down a name for her. Elias Churchill caught her in a ground snare in the Florentine Valley, in the wet eucalyptus forest west of Hobart, and sold her to Beaumaris Zoo, a small city zoo in Hobart, in the middle of May 1936. The zoo didn't record the sale and didn't announce it because ground snaring was illegal in Tasmania by then, and the trapper could have been fined for how he'd taken her. So the arrival of the last member of a species went into no ledger anywhere. She lived a few months behind wire in the middle of the capital city. On the night of September 7th, 1936, she was shut out of her shelter and died of exposure. 59 days before that, on July 10th, the Tasmanian Parliament had passed the law that made her species protected. 59 days. The protection arrived while the last individual on Earth was already in a cage in the middle of Hobart, and it did nothing for her at all because the thing that killed her wasn't hunting. It was a zoo that left her outside. The version of this story most of us grew up with has 3 parts to it, and the record breaks all 3. Part 1, that a mystery disease did most of the killing and the hunters just finished the job. Part 2, that the last one was a male named Benjamin. Part 3, that it ended in that enclosure in 1936 and there's been nothing new to find since. Start with the animal because the shape of it explains a lot of what came after. A thylacine was the largest meat-eating marsupial to survive into the modern era. Sandy brown, short coat, dark stripes running across the lower back and rump, and a long, stiff tail that came off the spine at an angle that looked wrong on a dog. From a distance, in bad light on a sheep run in the 1890s, it read as a wolf. And the men working those runs were the children and grandchildren of people who came from countries where wolves had already been hunted out, carrying the stories that went with them. That resemblance isn't a family connection. The thylacine's last common ancestor with any placental dog sits somewhere around 160 million years back, on the far side of the split between marsupials and everything else. 2 lineages, 2 continents, no contact whatsoever, and both of them arrived at nearly the same skull. Researchers publishing in Communications Biology in 2020 pushed that comparison further than anyone had before, tracking thylacine and gray wolf skulls through development rather than just measuring the adults, and the convergence held up. The rest of the animal was nothing like a dog. Both sexes carried a pouch. The females opened backward toward the tail and could hold up to 4 young at a time. The male had one too, a fold of skin that pulled his scrotum up against the body, which tells you something about the wet scrub and cutting grass. This animal spent its life pushing through. The jaw could open to something close to 80 degrees, which is most of the reason that zoo footage is so unsettling to watch. That gape is slow and wide, and it doesn't look like a threat display from any predator you've watched before. And in 2018, researchers in a genetics laboratory finished sequencing the whole thylacine genome and published it in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. The entire animal written out as DNA on a laboratory screen, more than 80 years after anybody last studied a living one. Hold on to that, because it comes back at the end of this. Now, part 1, the disease. Long before any government got involved, the sheepmen were already paying to have them killed. Private bounty schemes run by individual landowners were operating in Tasmania as early as 1830. 10 years later, the Van Diemen's Land Company, one of the largest landholders on the island, formalized its own, a standing payment for every thylacine brought in. That's a private corporation running an extermination program on a species nearly 50 years before the government put any of its own money into it. The Tasmanian government didn't join until 1888. £1 for an adult, 10 shillings for a juvenile. You've probably seen the photographs that came out of those years, men in work clothes and hats posing with dead thylacines hung over fence rails and shed doors. That scheme ran 21 years, and by the time it closed in 1909, it had paid out on 2,184 animals. Across the whole hunting era, from the 1830s into the 1920s, the total number of thylacines killed by people is estimated at around 3,500. Now do the arithmetic on the government's own program, because this is where the story people tell starts to come apart. 2,184 animals across 21 years averages out to about 100 a year. In 1900, the scheme paid out on 172. That's the high water mark, well above the average, a year when the hunters were finding them. Everything after 1900 slides, and it keeps sliding. By 1914, 5 years after the government scheme had already been shut down, the tally that the biologist Eric Goyler later assembled from the old handwritten bounty ledgers shows 3 scalps for the year. 3, on an island where a bounty had been worth real money, and the men who chased them knew every gully and every creek line on it. The hunters hadn't lost interest and they hadn't lost their skills. There was simply almost nothing left to find. So the government was still writing checks on a population its own paperwork showed had already collapsed. Nobody in Hobart stood up and read those numbers back into the room, and the legal protection that the collapse should have triggered showed up 36 years after the peak year in July 1936, by which point the only thylacine anybody could produce was sitting in that enclosure across town, which is where the disease usually enters the story. Reports of a sickness moving through thylacines circulated in the early 1900s, and for most of the last century, that's been the version everybody repeated. A distemper-like illness swept through, the population crashed, and the bounty was a sad footnote to a natural event. It's a comfortable story to tell in a country that keeps the animal on its coat of arms. It makes an extinction sound like weather. In 2013, a group of researchers published a study in the Journal of Animal Ecology that built a computer model of the whole system at once. The thylacine, the prey it depended on, the sheep and the people. Then they ran the human pressures on their own, with no epidemic switched on anywhere in the model. The direct bounty kills, the bush cleared for grazing, kangaroo and wallaby numbers dropping as people shot them, and introduced sheep took the grass they lived on. That combination by itself reproduced the crash that actually happened after 1905. Be careful about what that does and doesn't prove, because this is exactly where coverage of it overreaches. The study doesn't prove there was never any disease. Sick animals were reported, and some of those reports look genuine. What the modeling shows is that you don't need one. Every bit of work the epidemic was doing in the popular version, the bounty ledgers and the cleared paddocks already account for on their own. Take the disease out of the story completely, and the timeline still lands exactly where it landed. And if you're wondering how an institution can keep paying for dead thylacines years after the animals have stopped turning up, hold that thought, because the same casual bookkeeping shows up again at the end of this, in a museum with the last one. Which brings us to part 2 and the name. In May 1968, Frank Darby gave an interview in which he said he'd worked as a keeper at the Hobart Zoo and that the last thylacine there had been called Benjamin. That was 32 years after the animal died. The name went into print, and from print it went everywhere. It's in documentaries, on museum signs, on t-shirts and coffee mugs, and half of everything written about this species since. It's the reason an extinction has a first name attached to it, which is a real part of why people feel this one the way they do. Darby never worked at the zoo. There's no employment record putting him there, and Robert Paddle, the researcher who has spent decades in the archives working through record books and old zoo correspondence, has called the whole thing an unfortunate myth. The last thylacine was a female, and she was never called anything at all. And that's only the small correction. The one that actually changes the story is the footage. Paddle and the honorary curator Catherine Medlock went back through the museum and zoo record books together, page by page, and what they concluded is that the famous male, the animal in the black and white film, the one in nearly every photograph, died some months before September 1936. He wasn't the end of anything. After he died, the zoo wanted a thylacine on display, and it quietly took delivery of the trapped female from the Florentine Valley as a replacement. Sit with what that means for the record. Nearly every documentary you have ever seen about this species runs that footage over narration about the last of its kind dying alone in 1936. That's the wrong animal. He was already dead. The one who actually held that place was never filmed, never photographed as far as anyone can show, never named, and never officially recorded as arriving. Which raises the obvious question. If nobody wrote down that she came in and nobody photographed her while she was alive, then what happened to her after she died? Zoos don't throw away the last animal of a species. Somebody handled her body. The answer to that took another 86 years, and it's the worst part of this. If you're watching this because something in your area was declared gone and the reports never stopped coming in, put it in the comments. The state and the animal. That's most of what this channel covers, and the comments are usually where the next one comes from. Part 3. That it ended in 1936. The paperwork took its time. Under the standard rule that a species with no confirmed record for 50 years gets declared extinct, the IUCN made the call in 1982, counting from that night at Beaumaris. The Tasmanian government followed in 1986, half a century after its own parliament had passed the protection. Here's what makes 1982 a strange year to close the file. It's also the year of the most credible sighting anyone has on record. Hans Narding was a field officer with the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service, an experienced one working in the remote northwest of the state near Togari. He was asleep in the back of a four-wheel drive parked in wet forest in heavy rain. Around 2 in the morning, he woke up, and by his own account, he put a spotlight on an animal standing a short distance from him and identified it as a thylacine. That report didn't come from a tourist with a camera or somebody who wanted it to be true. It came from a trained wildlife officer whose actual job was identifying animals in the dark, in country he knew, and the state treated it accordingly. Parks and Wildlife funded a search, led by the wildlife biologist Nick Mooney, that put people on the ground for roughly a year across that northwestern corner of Tasmania, walking creek lines and scrub. It found nothing that could confirm a living thylacine, no animal and nothing testable, and that search is still, 40-odd years later, the high watermark of official interest. Nothing on that scale has been funded since. That was the most serious look anybody has taken at this question, and it came back empty. And that's the honest result of every search since. Over the 70 years leading up to 2005, more than 4,000 sightings had been reported across Tasmania, and not one of them produced a piece of physical evidence anybody could put under a microscope. In 2005, the Australian magazine The Bulletin put up $1.25 million Australian dollars in reward money for proof, and the terms were written tight. A live animal, uninjured, verified by an independent panel of experts, confirmed by DNA. Nothing else would count. The offer expired at the end of June that year, unclaimed. Now, if you're the kind of viewer who watches these and immediately asks where the physical evidence is, you're asking the right question, and the answer is that there isn't any. 90 years, thousands of reports, a professional wildlife officer's account, a state-funded search, a 7-figure reward with expert verification attached. And the physical record is still empty. Nobody has scraped one off a road or pulled hair off a fence wire or sent scat to a lab that came back thylacine. The counterweight is honest too, and it cuts the other way. Western Tasmania is deep temperate rainforest, mountain scrub, and open moorland, some of the least walked ground in the developed world, and proving that nothing lives out there is close to impossible. Not finding an animal in country like that doesn't tell you very much. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. That's the actual position, and anyone who tells you they know for certain either way has gone further than the evidence goes. The searching didn't stop when the government money did. It moved to volunteers. The Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia, started in 2014 by Neil Waters, reports around 10,000 members nationally and runs trail cameras strapped to trees, plus organized field searches through the northeast of the state. They've released camera footage of striped animals they couldn't identify, and to their credit, they haven't claimed those clips as confirmed thylacines, which is the right call because at night, at range, on a cheap sensor, you cannot rule out the animals that are definitely out there. Nobody has claimed the bulletin's reward, and nobody has put an animal in front of a panel. And then, in December 2022, one of them turned up anyway, inside a building in Hobart. It started with paper. Paddle and Medlock found an unpublished taxidermist's report from 1936 and 1937, a typed list of the specimens that had come through the workshop that year, and one of the entries was a thylacine that shouldn't have been unaccounted for. So the museum went through its thylacine holdings, every skin and every skull in the storerooms, and turned up a hide and a skeleton that matched no record they had. They weren't in the zoological collection, where a specimen like that belongs, in a labeled drawer, cataloged and numbered against the year it came in. They were in the education collection, in a cupboard, with the teaching material, the boxes that get wheeled into a classroom for a school visit. Nothing about a tanned hide on a table looks like the last of a species. It looks like a prop, which is most of the reason she sat there so long, and the reason it took a line in a taxidermist's paperwork rather than a zoologist to find her. That's the detail I keep coming back to. She hadn't been buried in a basement or lost in a fire. She'd been in active service the whole time. Somebody had skinned and flattened and tanned her so she could be handled, and for decade after decade, the museum brought school groups through and let them run their hands over the last of a species, while nobody in the room knew that's what it was. That's what the worn patches in the fur are. 85 years of children's hands on an animal the institution had misidentified since the year she died. She's on public display now in the museum's Thylacine Gallery in Hobart, labeled for what she is. Which leaves one thread still open, and it's the strangest one in the whole story. Remember that 2018 genome. At the University of Melbourne, the TIGRR lab has been using it as the reference map for a serious attempt at bringing the animal back, in partnership with the American biotechnology company Colossal Biosciences. The work runs on gene editing in a laboratory, taking cells from a living marsupial relative and rewriting them under a microscope toward the thylacine sequence, and on reproductive science built specifically for marsupials, because marsupial pregnancy doesn't work the way it does in placental mammals, and none of the standard IVF playbook transfers across. In 2025, Andrew Pask, the professor who built that lab, left his university post to join Colossal full-time as its chief biology officer, and the university's thylacine research was folded into a formal colossal Australia operation. That's real science, funded and credentialed and ongoing, and so far it has produced no thylacine. There's no living animal, no hybrid, nothing walking around a paddock in Tasmania. It's a long program with an uncertain ending, and anybody telling you the Tasmanian tiger is back is describing a press release rather than an animal. And even if it works, think about what it would actually give back. A genome doesn't carry what a mother taught her young about where to hunt in the Florentine Valley, or how one of them worked a gully at dusk. That went out of the world in the 1930s with the animals that knew it. Whatever eventually walks out of a colossal facility, if anything ever does, would have to learn all of that from scratch on an island nothing of its kind has walked in 90 years. So there are two things still running tonight: a search that has never produced a body, a photograph, or a scrap of testable tissue in 90 years of looking, and a laboratory in Melbourne trying to build one out of a genome sequenced from the dead. Neither one of them can tell you today how this finishes. What we do know is the part that's already finished. She was taken by a man who broke the law to get her, sold to a zoo that never wrote it down, shut out in the cold 2 months after her species finally became worth protecting on paper, and then filed in the wrong cupboard for 85 years while school children stroked her fur on class trips. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss is where the sightings sit. Not one part of how she got there is in any doubt at all.